Welcome to the STEM and Research podcast. My name is Arnav Das. I'm from Mumbai in India. I'm primarily interested in theoretical physics, mathematics, and philosophy. I like these subjects because I'm interested in answering the big questions on both the quantum and the cosmic scales. And I like interpreting and talking about and thinking about the universe around us in general. I'm the founder of an organization called Of Curiosity, which is a science outreach organization with a mission to popularize research um, and bring it to the mainstream, essentially.
So, hi, I'm Anwesha Das, and I'm from Kanpur in India. I really love cognitive science and I do math on the side. I think I have this combination because it really allows me to ask questions that matter. Um, I'm the founder of Innovation On, which is a local organization that aims at um, promoting research amongst middle and high school students. So how we do this is we conduct competitions, workshops, and we run a mentorship program in the school.
So, this podcast is essentially a collaboration between Of Curiosity and Innovation On. Um, Through this podcast, we hope to create a more pervasive appreciation for science and technology amongst our audience and our viewers. And we also hope to provide some direction to young students specifically, be it middle school, high school, or even undergraduate students who are looking to pursue endeavors related to research or even innovation.
So we believe that mere awareness can sometimes make a huge difference in both one's general outlook towards their future and how one chooses their time growing into the fields that they're passionate about. As we invite guests to speak about their stories, offer unique insights, and guide students to navigate STEM, we hope that our viewers are able to obtain solid takeaways. So the next section, we're just going to answer a couple very basic questions in the hope that it helps you understand us and our podcast better. So the first topic we're going to address here is, what does STEM mean to us? So Arnav, would you like to go first?
Yeah. So, fundamental research and the scientific method in general, for me, it's not something that exists inside of a textbook, or it's not something that you can just turn on and off when you're going to work and you're coming back from work. For me, it's a complete way of life, and it's a philosophy of living. As Richard Feynman said, there's a way of looking at things anew and asking questions about it only to discover how things are related to each other. So STEM essentially is a way that I can pursue these questions unapologetically.
That's a nice answer. So I was actually like interested in STEM right from the start because I think how I grew up. But as I mentioned before, I believe that asking impactful questions is really the key to doing research. Science is the medium through which like I can attempt to answer these questions or even dare to think about answering these questions. And that is why STEM means the world to me. So maybe next, do you want to briefly talk about what does hosting this podcast mean to us?
Sure. For me, this podcast is essentially a means to inspire people, inspire anyone with the access to an internet connection, and just basic information that comes with an internet connection. Because I remember when the topic of research was pretty novel for me, and I didn't actually know what research meant, and I just used to have an appreciation for science in general. So what hosting this podcast means to me is essentially having the ability to inspire more people to go from where I was to where I am.
Okay, so my reason for hosting this podcast actually remains the same as for my reason to even start the organization. It's still the primary aim is to inspire people. Although it had been locally, I thought the podcast is a great way to spread my outreach. And also, I have been a part of this organization for the past 2.5 years, and I've done quite a few events. And I thought it would be a great idea to further my interest by starting a podcast. So that was my reason.
Yeah. How did you get into research, and how did you get into science in general?
So I think I would first address how I got into STEM. Um, Both of my parents are scientists, and I grew up on an academic campus for an institution. So I kind of had STEM all around me while growing up. So that was the natural direction for me to take. I think the more important question here is, how did I get into research? Um, so I actually remember the exact moment I decided I wanted to do it as a teenager and not just as an adult, because when I was small, I still knew I wanted to do research as my career, but I didn't know I wanted to start so young. So I basically Googled up science competitions one day, and I came across a science fair. Now, this was back in middle school. And looking at the projects, I was so amazed that kids of around my age were doing things I couldn't imagine myself doing in many, many years to come. And I was just like mind blown. And I knew at that point of time that this is what I wanted myself to be doing in a very short period of time, maybe a year or two. Since then, I've had a lot of ups and downs, but the end result is that now I'm really passionate about cognitive science research, and I really can't imagine a life where I wouldn't be working in labs. So that's how I got into research. Now I participate in science fairs. That's the outlet, but I also work in labs year round. So Arnav, maybe you want to go ahead and talk about how you got into research?
Yeah. So I think the difference between us is that I don't emerge from a family of academics. So I didn't really know what research actually meant up until much later in my life. But I always had a knack for science. Like most children, I believe most children are natural scientists. So for me, I, for me, research was sort of the rudimentary form of the word, which is just the satiation of your curiosity, just answering questions, googling stuff, and um, gathering information, analyzing information. Then after a certain point in life, I researched about research, and I started doing projects of my own, and I started utilizing a bunch of resources that we'll talk about shortly in the podcast. And eventually I managed to get into research officially, through platforms like Science Fair, ISF, and these kinds of things.
That's really cool. Um, do you want to maybe go ahead and talk about the biggest challenge you might have faced? I think we'll just address like these questions, both of us. So maybe you want to go ahead first.
Sure. So I think the biggest challenge we faced might be quite similar, is that we're too young to be doing research. That's
Or
something
at
you
least
might have
people
heard.
say we're too young to do research.
Yeah, that's what I was about to say. You might have heard someone tell you that. But the whole idea for this podcast is essentially that we want to create a pervasive culture of doing research, as a career and beyond. So that's one thing that the biggest challenge for me would be to sort of deviate from the cultural norm of not pursuing research and going for more conventional careers in science. At least in the Indian context, research is often pushed into the background, or even neglected. And most students who enter science decide quite early on that either they want to be an engineer or a doctor. That's the gospel of truth that for some reason exists in our culture. But essentially the biggest challenge I faced was to break through that convention and pursue what I want unapologetically. That's what research also means to me.
That's really true. I think I resonate with you on most of these points. Is that although I did grow up in an academic institution like the campus setting, my story is actually not very different. Although I was immersed in a STEM setting, convincing people that I can actually like start like doing something of my own has been the hardest part. Because people, like professors especially, they would be, and that makes sense in their perspective, um, to let in a high school student into their lab, but eventually they come around. So I think the key is to keep asking them and keep approaching them. It was probably a whole year because before I could convince anybody to let me in, but since then things have been great, and I think um, just keep going is the key here.
Yeah, perseverance is what matters, especially
Yes.
given that um, it's pretty unusual for a professor to just
Mm.
witness a high school student walking into their office and asking them to let them do research with them, or
Mhm.
at least advise them in the research that they're doing. So I would say that it's understandable why it's difficult for us, but if you persevere, then things do get much
Yeah.
better.
I think I would just like add a short point here is that I'm from Uttar Pradesh, which is a state that doesn't have a single science fair. So I think lack of having people to look up to is also a challenge one can face because when you don't know anybody who's in a similar position as you, it's very easy to lose sight of what you want to do and just keep going. So that's been a challenge as well. Um, so we'll just briefly conclude by talking about what do we aim to do with this podcast and how are we going to proceed about it. So in this podcast, we'll discuss about resources, opportunities for research and other explorations academically, like science programs, science fairs, how to enter them, etc. We would also talk about creating your own opportunities or just approaching people, convincing them. How do you approach them and what should you know before you approach somebody? And we might even do a segment on DIY science where we just talk about independent stuff you can do at home since we're at lockdown. So maybe we would talk about the importance of data here, but we'll figure that out. Um,
Sure.
I think,
We have a
yeah.
couple guests
Mhm.
lined up that we're excited for them to come on this podcast and talk about their stories. Maybe you want to tell people like
Yeah,
who those guests are going to
sure.
be. Like,
So we wanted to actually have a very diverse lineup here. So we're going to have young researchers from all over the country and maybe abroad who do research or work in labs or have done science fairs. So they're going to be high school students, and we also hope to include undergrad students here. As to having a different perspective here on the other side, we also want to include professors and professional researchers just to see what do they think about having kids do research. um, yeah. With this podcast, we hope to foster a strong community of young researchers. We are hosting this podcast with the aim of making the navigation process of opportunities, using these opportunities, and reaching out for these opportunities a easier process for all of you out there.
yeah, and I would like to add on and say that even if we're able to affect the way one viewer was spending their time and we're able to inspire them, I think this whole endeavor has been worth it. I'm pretty sure both of us share the same sentiment. We hope we're able to create some real tangible impact on the viewers and help people gain access to so many of the opportunities and avenues out there. We have some great guest speakers lined up, as I mentioned previously, and we're glad that the viewers are accompanying us on this journey.
We'll see you in the next episode.